They did not just skip me for the role I earned, they handed it to a 29-year-old who still got lost finding the executive floor. They expected me to train her, swallow the humiliation, and quietly fade away. What they did not know was I saw the setup weeks earlier. By the time they begged me to take my title back, Plan B was already moving, and it was far more expensive than they could ever afford. My name is Haley Nelson. I am 41 years old, and for the past 16 years, I have been the quiet pulse keeping North Hollow Response Group alive. We are a firm built on worst-case scenarios, handling emergency operations and business continuity strategies for high-end hotel chains, premium food distribution networks, and top-tier logistics companies across the Midwest. When a blizzard shuts down 3 interstate highways, or a regional power grid fails during a record-breaking freeze, North Hollow is the number our clients call. More accurately, I was the number they called. I built our continuity division from a neglected, underfunded basement project into the primary revenue engine of the entire company. So, when the senior executive above me finally announced his retirement, the succession plan was supposed to be an unspoken corporate law. Everyone knew the promotion was mine. The clients knew it. I knew it. But corporate loyalty is a myth sold to the naive, and I was about to receive a masterclass in its exact market value. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was summoned to the top floor, expecting a handshake and a finalized executive contract. Instead, I walked into an ambush. CEO Bryce Kessler sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk, his posture a little too relaxed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Beside him sat Gavin Mott, our head of human resources, clutching a leather binder like a shield. Bryce leaned forward, steepling his fingers in a gesture he had likely practiced in front of a mirror. "Haley, we cannot thank you enough for your dedication. The groundwork you have laid here is phenomenal. But as we look toward the next decade, the board feels strongly that we need to take the division in a new direction, a more modernized, scalable direction." The words hovered in the chilled air of the office. Before I could process the exact angle of the knife slipping into my back, Bryce delivered the fatal twist. "We are thrilled to announce that Tessa Vaughn will be stepping into the executive director role." Tessa Vaughn, a 29-year-old who had been with North Hollow for exactly 1 month. She had a shiny resume filled with startup buzzwords, a freshly printed degree, and absolutely zero experience in actual crisis management. She did not know our vendors. She did not know our regional protocols. She did not know that when a client's cold storage facility loses backup power, you have exactly 4 hours to reroute $1 million of inventory before it spoils. "And where does that leave me?" I asked, my voice dangerously steady. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I kept my breathing slow, forcing my heart rate to remain calm while the room spun. Gavin flipped open his binder, looking everywhere but at my face. "We are creating a highly specialized role just for you. Haley, transition strategist. We need you to map out your processes, interface with Tessa, and ensure a seamless handover of the institutional knowledge you possess." Transition strategist. It was a beautiful, hollow phrase. It meant they wanted me to drain my own brain into a corporate hard drive, hand the keys to the girl with the right aesthetic, and quietly fade into the wallpaper until I was obsolete enough to terminate. I nodded once, stood up, and walked out of the room. I did not argue. You do not argue with a burning building. You find the exits. The true depth of the humiliation, however, was reserved for the morning after. When I arrived at the office at my usual time of 6:45, my nameplate was already gone from the heavy oak door of my office. It had been pried off, leaving behind a faint scratch on the dark wood. Inside, the space I had occupied for nearly a decade was entirely unrecognizable. Tessa was already there. She had brought in a massive, sprawling fiddle-leaf fig tree that blocked the window. Her framed Master of Business Administration degree was proudly mounted directly behind her desk. She looked up as I paused in the doorway, flashing a brilliant, perfectly manufactured smile. "Haley, good morning." I was just setting up my vision board, I really want this space to reflect future-forward leadership. I'm hoping we can synergize our approaches today. Good morning, Tessa, I said. My tone was flat, devoid of any edge she could report to human resources. I turned and walked down the hall to my newly assigned desk, a cramped cubicle positioned right outside the printing room. It was the geographic equivalent of an insult. 2 hours later, we had our first division-wide meeting under the new regime. Tessa stood at the head of the conference table, clicking through a slide deck that looked like it had been purchased from a stock image website. We need to focus on standardizing the experience, Tessa announced, gesturing broadly at a pie chart that made no logical sense. Our regional responses are too fragmented. We need a unified corporate voice. For example, when dealing with the Alcott Crest account, we need to eliminate localized variables. She pronounced it Alcott, emphasizing the wrong syllable. It was Alcott, like the author. A minor detail to a stranger, but a glaring red flag to anyone who actually knew the client. Reed Alcott despised people who did not bother to learn his family's name. Tessa continued to speak, entirely oblivious to the heavy, suffocating silence in the room. She talked about flattening the response curve and creating standardized templates for emergency logistics. She was trying to apply a cookie-cutter methodology to a division that survived purely on bespoke, split-second problem-solving and deep personal relationships. I did not correct her. I simply sat there, my hands folded on the table. But the worst part was not Tessa's ignorance. It was the reaction of my team. These were people I had mentored for years. People whose mistakes I had covered, whose promotions I had fought for. Now, as Tessa dismantled our entire operational philosophy with a laser pointer and a smile, not a single one of them looked at me. They stared at their notepads. They inspected their pens. They stared at the carpet. The collective betrayal was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, suffocating surrender. They were bowing their heads to the new power dynamic, choosing self-preservation over loyalty. The silence in that room stretched on for entirely too long, thick with guilt and cowardice. After the meeting, I returned to my cubicle to do the only thing I was supposed to do: transition my knowledge. I opened my computer to pull up the master contact list for our secondary logistics vendors to verify a route Tessa had just questioned. A gray pop-up box appeared on my screen. Access denied. I frowned. I navigated to the shared drive holding the upcoming board packets. Access denied. My pulse finally began to quicken. I tried to log into the financial portal where I had spent the last 5 years approving emergency expenditure overrides. My credentials had been completely revoked. I sat back in my cheap, unergonomic chair, the reality of the situation washing over me in cold, sharp waves. They had not made this decision yesterday afternoon. You do not reconfigure administrative rights, alter security protocols, and strip a senior director's system access in a few hours. This had been in motion for weeks, perhaps months. Bryce and Gavin had smiled in my face, asked for my quarterly projections, and patted my back while quietly orchestrating my systematic erasure from the company I had built. They had locked me out before I even knew I was fired. They thought I was just a hard worker. They thought I was a loyal soldier who would take the demotion, train the shiny new executive, and eventually resign quietly to save whatever dignity I had left. They believed my entire worth was tied to the title they had just taken away. That evening, I sat alone at my dining table. The apartment was completely silent. I did not pour a glass of wine. I did not cry. I did not vent to a friend on the phone. Emotions are a luxury you cannot afford when you are standing in the middle of a war zone. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my notebook. It was a heavy, black, hardbound book I had carried for years, the place where I drafted disaster recovery plans, mapped out worst-case scenarios, and engineered ways to save sinking ships. I opened to a fresh, blank page. The paper was crisp and white under the dim overhead light. I picked up my pen. I did not write down a list of my grievances. I did not write a letter of resignation. I did not write Tessa's name or Bryce's name. I pressed the ink into the paper and wrote exactly 2 words: Plan B. It took exactly 72 hours for Tessa to begin tearing down the load-bearing walls of the division. Her first official act was a division-wide email, sent at 8:15 on a Wednesday morning, detailing a new, mandated workflow. She summarily revoked all local exception handling authority. Previously, if a regional manager in Omaha saw a massive blizzard rolling in, they could authorize up to $50,000 in emergency overtime and preemptive inventory routing without waiting for corporate approval. Now, every single deviation from the standard operating procedure had to be routed through a centralized ticketing system at our headquarters. She was forcing every bespoke, highly sensitive client protocol into a single, rigid, unyielding template. Bryce, naturally, replied all to her email within 5 minutes. Outstanding initiative. Tessa, his message read. This is exactly the necessary modernization we need to scale this division. Out with the legacy bottlenecks. In with agile standardization. Legacy bottlenecks. That was his glossy, corporate translation for the 16 years of fail-safes and relationships I had built to keep our clients from losing millions during natural disasters. He was praising her for burning the lifeboats while the ship was still at sea. The reality of this agile standardization hit my personal cell phone exactly 2 days later. It was a text message, arriving at 7:30 in the evening. The sender was Reed Alcott, the heir and operational head of Alcott Crest Hotels, our largest and most demanding account. He had trusted my judgment since the Great Freeze of 2019. When my team manually sourced 80 industrial generators in under 10 hours to keep his flagship properties open. Haley, what is happening over there? The message read. Your new girl just sent over our winter contingency renewal. It looks like a generic pamphlet you would hand out at a trade show. Call me. I stared at the glowing screen in the quiet of my living room. Reed paid us $3.5 million a year, not just for emergency response, but for absolute, ironclad assurance that his luxury properties would never experience a disruption visible to a paying guest. A generic pamphlet was not just poor service. It was a profound insult. I wanted to call him. I wanted to tell him they had locked me out. But I was technically no longer his account executive, and complaining to a client was a breach of contract that would cost me my severance. Instead, I typed a careful, legally ambiguous reply. I am transitioning to a strategic role. Reed, Tessa is your point of contact now. I am sure she will be happy to walk you through the new framework. I hit send, knowing exactly how a man like Reed would react to a corporate buzzword like framework. The next morning, the hidden machinery of my demotion began to expose itself. I was at my desk, quietly reviewing a vendor routing table that I still had read-only access to, when I noticed a massive compliance flag being pushed through the system. Tessa was aggressively fast-tracking a new dispatch software integration. The vendor was Harrogate Systems. I felt the blood freeze in my veins, my hand pausing on the mouse. Harrogate. 6 months ago, Bryce had pushed that exact contract onto my desk for final executive approval. I had audited their software and flatly refused to sign off on it. Their system relied on a rigid, algorithmic queue that entirely stripped away human intervention. In a real crisis, when an interstate collapses or a port strikes, algorithms fail because they cannot negotiate. You need a human operator who knows which secondary trucking company owes them a favor, or which warehouse manager will open the doors at 2 a.m. Harrogate removed that mechanism entirely, replacing operators with an automated ticketing queue. I walked to the break room to get coffee, my mind racing. Owen Pike, our senior finance director and one of the few people who still had the courage to make eye contact with me, was standing by the sink, pretending to read the notices on the bulletin board. Have you seen the Harrogate projections? Owen murmured, not looking away from a flyer for a charity run. I saw the integration flag, I replied quietly, pouring dark roast into my ceramic mug. I killed that contract back in October. Bryce revived it on Monday, Owen said, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. Tessa signed the preliminary agreement yesterday. The upfront savings look phenomenal on her PowerPoint slides. a 25% reduction in operational overhead. But Haley, the back-end logic is a nightmare. If the system lags during a live event, the penalty clauses in our client master service agreements will trigger immediately. We are looking at losing millions of dollars in retention penalties just to save $400,000 on software licensing. It was not just the financial risk. It was the deliberate narrative they were building to hide it. Later that afternoon, Marisol Trent, our lead data analyst, cornered me near the elevators. Her usually calm, analytical demeanor was entirely gone. She looked terrified. "They are scrubbing the dashboards," she said, her eyes darting down the hallway to ensure no one was listening. Tessa asked me to adjust the parameters on the regional response times for the upcoming board packet. She wants us to exclude weather anomalies from the average ticket resolution metric. Our entire business model is based on weather anomalies. "Marisol," I said softly, my tone completely flat. "I know," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly. "But if I filter them out, her new centralized approval process looks like it is operating at 99% efficiency. If I leave the real data in, it shows a delay of over 4 hours per ticket. The new system is making the problems look smaller, so no one questions the Harrogate rollout at the quarterly meeting." I took a slow, deep breath. The picture was now painfully complete. The final confirmation came during our Friday afternoon operational review. Tessa was leading the meeting, standing in front of a massive projection screen displaying Marisol's sanitized, entirely fictional data. She was glowing with the unearned confidence of someone who had never had to look a furious client in the eye. "As you can see," Tessa beamed, pointing a laser pointer at a sharply climbing green line, "by routing all logistical approvals through the Chicago hub, we have decreased redundancy by 30%. Furthermore, our integration with Harrogate will automate the Tier 2 logistics for the Alcott properties by Q3. She paused, waiting for the room to validate her brilliance. The room was dead silent. I sat at the far end of the long conference table, my hands resting neatly on my closed black notebook. "Tessa," I said. My voice was completely calm, devoid of anger or malice, yet it sliced through the quiet room like a scalpel. She looked at me, her manufactured smile tightening at the corners. "Yes, Haley. Do you have some transition feedback for the group?" "Just a minor operational detail," I replied, holding her gaze with terrifying stillness. "The Alcott properties do not utilize Tier 2 logistics. They operate on a custom active cold chain protocol due to their fine dining imports. Automating them through a standard Tier 2 queue will breach their service level agreement within the first 24 hours. I did not elaborate. I did not explain how to fix the routing. I did not offer to call Reed to smooth it over. I simply stated the catastrophic fact and let it hang heavily in the air. Tessa's face flushed a deep, mottled red. She looked down at her tablet, then back at the screen, desperately scrambling to find a corporate buzzword to cover her sheer ignorance. But she had nothing. The silence in the room returned, but this time it was not the silence of collective cowardice. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of 30 seasoned professionals watching their new leader realize she was steering a massive ship directly into a reef she did not even know existed. I did not say another word for the rest of the meeting. I simply watched her drown in her own presentation. As I walked back to my desk, the final, lingering layer of my humiliation evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I had spent the entire week thinking I had been replaced because I was too old, too expensive, or simply out of favor with the new executive regime. I had thought it was about Tessa being younger, more pliable, and cheaper to employ. I was completely wrong. I was not removed because I was not good enough. I was removed because I was the only person in the building with the authority, the operational knowledge, and the spine to say no to the Harrogate system. Bryce needed that vendor contract signed. He needed those artificial short-term savings to boost the quarterly metrics, likely to secure his own executive bonus or force through a larger board mandate. I was standing directly in the way of his slide deck, so he brought in a pawn who did not know any better. He wrapped his reckless agenda in the glossy, unimpeachable language of digital transformation and modern leadership, using a shiny new executive to blindly rubber stamp a disaster. This was no longer a petty corporate squabble over a corner office and a parking spot. The conflict was not between me and Tessa Vaughn. Tessa was just a blunt instrument Bryce had picked up to clear his path. The real war was between the absolute, gritty truth of how things actually worked when the world caught fire, and a hollow, destructive conspiracy wrapped in a tailored suit. And while Bryce thought he had smartly neutralized his only threat, he had actually done something much worse. He had entirely freed me from my loyalty. It took exactly 3 weeks for the theoretical damage on Tessa's pristine spreadsheets to manifest into tangible, catastrophic reality. The first major casualty of her new centralized approval matrix was a Midwestern hospitality syndicate during an early November polar vortex. Historically, when temperatures dropped 30 degrees below zero and ice coated the interstates, our local dispatchers had the unilateral authority to reroute supply trucks and approve emergency snow removal logistics on the spot. They moved with speed because they had the autonomy to do so. Under Tessa's newly implemented protocol, every single operational deviation had to be logged into the Harrogate portal and approved by a Tier 1 manager sitting in our climate-controlled headquarters. When the storm hit, a critical shipment of industrial heating fuel for 3 luxury lodges in northern Michigan was heavily delayed. The local dispatcher, a highly capable 10-year veteran, attempted to authorize a secondary local vendor who charged a premium due to the weather hazard. The new system immediately locked him out. He submitted an urgent ticket. It sat in the centralized queue for 4 brutal hours, while the lodge's primary backup generators sputtered and died. Guests in $400 a night rooms woke up seeing their own breath in the dark. The syndicate threatened a breach of contract lawsuit before the sun even fully rose. That failure was a minor tremor compared to the operational earthquake that hit our premium food distribution account 2 days later. This client supplied imported Wagyu beef, fresh truffles, and artisanal dairy to the most exclusive restaurants across the region. At 2 a.m. on a Thursday, their primary refrigerated transport hub suffered a total compressor failure. In the old days, the night manager would have immediately called our designated backup cold storage facility, verbally authorized the exorbitant overtime transfer fee, and moved the inventory within 90 minutes. Instead, tethered by Tessa's new reporting mandate, the manager was forced to fill out a comprehensive risk assessment form, attach 3 separate vendor quotes, and submit the entire package for morning review before touching a single pallet of food. By the time a digital transformation specialist at our headquarters finally approved the transfer at 8:15 in the morning, the internal temperature of the holding facility had been sitting above the safe zone for 6 agonizing hours. $250,000 in premium perishable goods had to be written off and destroyed. The client did not just threaten a lawsuit, they demanded an immediate in-person audit of our entire operational capability and threatened to pull their entire account portfolio. Tessa's response to these compounding disasters was a masterclass in corporate delusion. Instead of recognizing that her rigid system was actively choking our response times, she blamed the human element. She called an emergency all-hands meeting, her voice tight with an artificial, practiced authority. "What we are seeing across the board is a textbook resistance to innovation," she announced, pacing at the front of the room. "The Harrogate system is functioning exactly as designed. The issue is a localized failure to adhere to the correct submission protocols. To ensure better compliance moving forward, I am instituting a secondary daily reporting requirement. All regional managers will now submit an end-of-day summary detailing every single ticket they entered and a justification for why." She was pouring gasoline on a team that was already drowning. She was forcing exhausted crisis managers to do more administrative work to justify the very system that was preventing them from doing their actual jobs. The energy in the room did not explode into open rebellion. It simply collapsed inward. Our division had once operated like a highly trained strike team, moving with precision, pride, and mutual respect. Now, it was a room full of heavy sighs, defeated postures, and dead eyes. Over the next 10 days, I watched the subtle, undeniable signs of a mass professional exodus. I saw our absolute best logistics coordinators rapidly minimizing their internet browser windows when a manager walked by. The blue header of professional networking sites lingering on their screens. I saw hushed, tense conversations happening in the stairwells and the parking garage. The people who actually held the division together were quietly, desperately updating their resumes. As the operational failures piled up, the high-level clients bypassed the ticketing system entirely. They did what they had always done. They called Bryce's office directly, furious, panicked, and demanding answers. And every single time a major account threatened to terminate their contract, Bryce's intercom would buzz my desk. He would call me up to his sprawling corner office, drop his arrogant facade entirely, and beg for a miracle. "Haley, the chief operating officer of the food distribution network is screaming at me," he would say, pacing behind his heavy desk, his tie slightly loosened. "Tessa's team cannot seem to calm them down or get the routing right. Just jump in and fix this. Call in a favor. You know exactly how they operate." He wanted me to be his personal firefighter, rushing into the burning building to salvage his executive reputation, while simultaneously denying me the title, the pay, and the respect of the fire chief. I did exactly what he asked, but absolutely nothing more. I would make the phone call. I would calm the client using the deep trust and history I had painstakingly built over 16 long years. I would remind them of the specific, customized touchpoints we had established in the past to secure their loyalty, but I did not create new solutions. I did not fix the underlying, rotting framework Tessa was building. I merely applied a temporary, highly localized bandage to a severed artery. Tessa, realizing that she was completely out of her depth and that the clients despised her, began pulling me into her glass-walled office almost daily. She would sit across from me, her digital tablet ready, and demand the impossible. "I need you to write down everything that is not in the client relationship management software," she ordered one afternoon, tapping her stylus sharply against the screen. "Every unrecorded preference, every backdoor vendor contact, every informal operational agreement. We need to formalize your institutional knowledge into a standardized document so the wider team can utilize it." She looked at me as if 16 years of nuanced human interaction, late-night phone calls, and high-stakes negotiations could be extracted like raw data from a corrupted hard drive and pasted into a sterile corporate manual. "I have already uploaded all contractual obligations, approved vendor lists, and standard operating procedures to the shared drive. Tessa," I replied smoothly, my voice devoid of any readable emotion. "Everything the company legally requires to service these accounts is fully documented. I am not talking about the legal requirements. Haley," she snapped, her frustration finally breaking through her polished veneer. "I am talking about the way you get the warehouse managers in Detroit to waive the late fees. I am talking about how you know exactly which dispatchers will bend the transport rules during a storm. I need that specific information." I looked at her, my expression perfectly neutral, holding her gaze until she shifted uncomfortably in her expensive chair. "That is not data, Tessa. That is trust. You cannot put trust in a standardized template." I gave her nothing but the absolute bare minimum compliance. I provided the necessary files. I answered direct operational questions with literal, unhelpful accuracy. I flatly refused to hand over the true essence of my value, the deep understanding of human nature, the rhythm of a crisis, and the intrinsic knowledge of what absolutely cannot be shoved into an automated system. While Tessa obsessed over forcing my experience into a spreadsheet, I was engaged in a much more meticulous, devastating form of data collection. I began an intensive, quiet archival process. Every evening, after the office emptied out and the overhead lights dimmed, I sat at my cramped cubicle and forwarded specific, highly sensitive documents to an encrypted external drive. I was not stealing proprietary secrets. I was building an airtight, irrefutable timeline of corporate negligence. I saved every single email where I had explicitly warned Bryce about the catastrophic operational risks of the Harrogate software. I saved the internal meeting minutes where my objections were formally dismissed in favor of cost-cutting. I saved the original vendor contract I had flatly refused to sign, complete with my highlighted concerns regarding automated failure rates and exception handling. I was not actively sabotaging North Hollow Response Group. Sabotage requires effort, malice, and direct action. I was doing something far more lethal and entirely legally defensible. For 16 years, my unparalleled competence had been an invisible, impenetrable shield, protecting the executives from the consequences of their own short-sighted, greedy decisions. I was the safety net that caught their disastrous mistakes before they hit the ground. I did not cut the net. I simply stepped out of the way. I stopped shielding them. I let the raw, unforgiving reality of their terrible choices take its natural, destructive course. And as the division began to fracture under the weight of its own enforced incompetence, my black notebook began to fill. The air inside the dark, oak-paneled booth of the downtown speakeasy was thick with the scent of gin and old paper. I sat across from Nora Keene, my oldest friend and one of the most ruthless labor attorneys in the city. I had handed her a copy of my original executive contract, along with the heavily sanitized transition agreement HR had shoved across my desk weeks ago. Nora did not speak for 10 long minutes. She just traced the lines of ink with her manicured fingernail, her eyes scanning the dense legalese with predatory focus. "This is not a restructuring, Haley," Nora finally said, tapping the heavy glass of her bourbon on the wooden table. "This is a highly calculated excision. Look at Clause 4, Section B. They are demoting you exactly 3 months before your next major equity vestment in the continuity division. They are forcing you into a corner, hoping you quit in frustration so they can absorb your unvested shares back into the executive pool." I leaned back against the leather booth, absorbing the cold, clinical reality of her words. "So it is just about the money. Bryce wants my equity. It is always about the money. But this is clumsier than a simple equity grab," Nora replied, her eyes narrowing as she flipped back to the original document I had signed 16 years ago. "They missed something, a massive blind spot in your initial terms of employment. When you built this division, you insisted on a proprietary framework clause. Do you remember?" I nodded slowly. Back then, the company had nothing. I had brought my own methodologies, my own vendor relationships, and my own crisis matrices. "According to this," Nora continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "if they substantially diminish your operational authority, but continue to generate revenue using the specific strategic frameworks and client networks you authored, your non-compete clause is entirely nullified. Furthermore, it triggers a constructive dismissal loophole that essentially releases you from any obligation to protect their internal intellectual property. They think they tied your hands, Haley. But by keeping you on as a transition strategist to mine your brain, they just handed you the key to your own handcuffs." I took a slow sip of my water. I did not want to quit. Not yet. If I walked away now, I would just be another disgruntled employee fading into obscurity while Bryce and Tessa paraded my achievements as their own. To win, I needed absolute, irrefutable proof of their negligence. I needed perfect timing. And most importantly, I needed my enemies to believe I was thoroughly defeated and obediently compliant. The next day, the true scope of Bryce's deception began to unspool, not through grand confrontations, but through the quiet, terrified whispers of my remaining allies. It started with Marisol. She intercepted me in the narrow corridor leading to the server room, an area entirely devoid of security cameras. She was clutching her laptop tightly against her chest. She opened the screen just enough for me to see a draft of the upcoming quarterly board presentation. "Look at the regional performance metrics," Marisol whispered, her voice trembling. "Tessa instructed me to apply a smoothing algorithm to the failure rates. We are currently dropping 22% of our service-level agreements due to the Harrow Gate bottleneck. But the slide going to the board shows a dip of only 4%. Tessa literally added a footnote calling it an acceptable transition variance. They are lying to the investors. Haley." In writing, I stared at the manipulated chart. "Print the raw data logs, Marisol, date stamp them. Hide physical copies in your personal locker and do not send anything over the company server." She nodded, snapping the laptop shut and hurrying away. She was not the only one digging. 2 days later, Owen Pike cornered me in the underground parking garage. He had been quietly tracing the financial architecture behind the new software implementation. His face was pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. "Harrow Gate Systems is not an independent vendor," Owen said flatly, leaning against the concrete pillar next to my car. "I ran the corporate registration through a secondary financial database. The company is owned by a holding group in Delaware. That holding group is managed by a blind trust. I pulled a favor with a friend in commercial banking to look at the trust's origination documents." He paused, ensuring the garage was empty. "The primary beneficiary of that trust is Bryce Kessler's brother-in-law." Owen revealed. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Harrogate was not just a bad software platform. It was a vehicle for embezzlement. Bryce was funneling millions of dollars of company money into his own family's pockets through exorbitant licensing fees. But to make the purchase order happen, he needed the division head to sign off. I had refused. I had audited the software, declared it unfit for crisis management, and blocked the deal. The final, devastating confirmation arrived from the most unlikely source, Lydia Mercer, the fiercely private head of corporate compliance. She invited me to a supposedly random lunch at a crowded diner blocks away from the office. Between bites of a dry sandwich, she slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "I handle the auditing for executive search requisitions," Lydia said, her eyes fixed on her coffee cup. "I am not supposed to show you this, but I cannot sit by and watch them destroy you." I unfolded the paper. It was the Human Resources requisition form for my former role, dated 3 days before Tessa was formally hired. Under the required qualifications section, the original text demanding 10 years of operational crisis experience had been struck through with a thick red line. In its place, someone had typed a new mandate: "Must possess a strong digital transformation image and prioritize vendor integration over legacy protocols." The criteria were completely rewritten at the 11th hour, Lydia explained quietly. "They engineered the job description specifically to exclude you and fast-track Tessa. They needed someone who would look great on a brochure, speak the language of modern tech, and ask absolutely zero questions when told to sign the Harrogate integration papers." I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. I finally understood the entirety of the play. The theater of my demotion had been written, cast, and directed long before Tessa Vaughn even walked through the glass doors of North Hollow. I was not pushed aside for a fresh perspective or a younger face. I was systematically removed to clear the road for a massive, fraudulent commercial transaction that I had stubbornly obstructed. Tessa was not the new queen of the division. She was merely a glamorous, oblivious decoy placed on the throne while the treasury was being looted. That night, the silence of my apartment felt different. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of defeat. It was the sharp, charged silence of a loaded weapon. I sat at my dining table and opened my black notebook. I flipped past the pages of operational strategies and vendor contacts. I reached the back of the book, where I had tucked a single, yellowed piece of paper. It was a certificate of incorporation from the state registry. 5 years ago, after a particularly grueling negotiation where North Hollow had taken all the credit for my sleepless nights, I had paid a small fee to register an independent limited liability company. I had never done anything with it. It was a brief fantasy of independence, a safety valve I had built and then promptly forgotten as the daily grind consumed me. I opened my personal laptop and navigated to the state business portal. I entered the dormant registration number. The screen loaded, displaying the inactive status in stark red letters. I pulled out my credit card. I paid the $250 reinstatement fee. I updated the mailing address. I clicked the final confirmation button. The screen refreshed. The red text turned a vibrant, undeniable green, active. The company name stared back at me from the glowing screen North Ledger Advisory. For the first time since this nightmare began, a genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. Plan B was no longer just a coping mechanism. It was no longer a vague idea scribbled in a notebook to make myself feel better in the dark. It had a legal framework. It had a corporate identity. It had a fully open, legitimate door. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the distant city skyline. Bryce Kessler and his board of directors thought they had buried me alive. They thought I was trapped in a cubicle, silently choking on my own pride while they dismantled my life's work. They had absolutely no idea that down in the dark, I was not suffocating. I was building an empire from the ground up, and I was about to pull the earth right out from under them. The ambient noise of the operations floor had shifted from a productive hum to the frantic, chaotic pitch of a sinking ship. It was shortly after 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. I was quietly at my cubicle, logging my required administrative hours, when Tessa's shadow fell across my keyboard. She looked terrible. The flawless corporate veneer she had worn like armor for the past month was visibly cracking. Her designer blazer was wrinkled, and her eyes held the wide, hollow look of someone who had just realized their parachute was not going to open. "In my office," Tessa said. Her voice was thin, lacking its usual performative authority. "Right now." I followed her into the corner office that used to be mine. The giant fiddle-leaf fig tree she had brought in was already dropping brown leaves onto the expensive rug. A perfect, tragic metaphor for her tenure. She closed the heavy oak door and leaned against it, breathing rapidly. "What is going on with the Alcott expansion?" she demanded, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "I just got off the phone with their procurement director. They are completely freezing their portfolio expansion for the next fiscal year. They refuse to sign the continuity addendum unless they speak with someone who actually understands their infrastructure. I offered them the premium Harrogate tier. I offered to waive the onboarding fees. It does not make sense." She stepped away from the door, pacing frantically behind the desk. "Bryce told me this division was a structural disaster. He said everything was bloated, disorganized, and barely functioning under the old leadership. He promised me that if I just applied my standardized matrix, the margins would correct themselves automatically." I sat down in one of the leather guest chairs, smoothing my skirt with deliberate slowness. I watched her unravel. "What else did Bryce tell you?" I asked, my voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. Tessa ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair, ruining the severe part. "He said replacing you was already cleared from the absolute top. He told me the board wanted you gone because you were a legacy bottleneck. All I had to do was come in, execute the vendor integration, and I would be shielded from any operational fallout. I was supposed to be the architect of a new era. Now I am spending my entire day apologizing to furious hotel managers who cannot get emergency fuel deliveries during a freeze." I looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since she had taken my nameplate off the door. She was not a mastermind. She was not the brilliant new queen of the division. She was bait. Bryce had found someone arrogant enough to believe she could fix a machine she did not understand, and naive enough to sign her name to a fraudulent software contract without reading the source code. "Did you ever ask to see the original workflow audits?" I asked quietly, letting the question hang in the air. "Did you ever question why an external digital transformation consultant was the one who drafted your specific job description instead of our human resources department?" Tessa froze. "What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a secure message from Lydia Mercer in compliance. She had sent a heavily encrypted attachment. It was a scanned copy of the board meeting minutes from exactly 6 weeks ago, long before Tessa was even interviewed. I opened the file. There, listed clearly under the executive succession plan, was my name. I had been unanimously approved by the executive committee to take over the division, but on the second page, an addendum had been stapled in at the last minute. An external consultant, conveniently operating out of the exact same Delaware holding company that owned Harrogate Systems, had strongly recommended a sudden shift in leadership criteria to ensure the new software adoption went smoothly. My name was crossed out in dark ink. Tessa's profile parameters were heavily outlined. I looked up from the screen. meeting her panicked gaze. "You were never brought here to lead. Tessa, you were brought here to sign purchase orders that I refused to sign. Bryce sold you a glossy fantasy so you would act as his human shield when the clients inevitably rebelled against a failing system." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the realization slowly draining the remaining color from her face. She sank into the leather chair behind the desk, her posture entirely defeated. "He set me up," she whispered into the quiet room. "I am just a placeholder." My phone vibrated again. A direct text message from Reed Alcott appeared on my screen. "Your new director is a massive liability." The message read, "We are freezing the expansion contract immediately. If you are planning an exit strategy, Haley, I expect to be your first phone call. I am not leaving my properties in the hands of an automated algorithm and a child." 10 minutes later, another message arrived from the chief operating officer of our largest premium logistics account. They echoed Reed perfectly. They were terminating their service-level agreement the moment the penalty clause expired. They did not trust the North Hollow brand anymore. They trusted the person who always answered the phone at 2 in the morning when their supply chain collapsed. For 16 years, they had not been buying the corporate logo on the letterhead. They had been buying my absolute reliability. I sat in the quiet office, surrounded by Tessa's frantic energy and the dying leaves of her expensive plant. I looked at the heavy oak desk that I had coveted for so long. I had spent a decade and a half sacrificing my nights, my weekends, and my peace of mind to earn the right to sit behind that specific piece of wood. I had believed the lie that if I worked hard enough, the institution would eventually reward me with power. But looking at the terrified 29-year-old sitting in that chair, completely manipulated and abandoned by the men who put her there, the illusion shattered entirely. The chair was worthless. The title was a trap. The entire corporate structure was a rotting house built on a foundation of lies and embezzlement. Bryce had weaponized my loyalty against me, and when that failed, he had weaponized Tessa's ambition. If I fought to expose Bryce internally, if I went to the board of directors and demanded my rightful promotion, what would I actually win? I would win the supreme privilege of cleaning up a massive, fraudulent mess. I would win the right to beg furious clients to trust a brand that had actively tried to deceive them. I would be fighting for a kingdom that was already burning to the ground. Right then and there, the nature of my vengeance shifted completely. The anger evaporated from my chest, leaving behind a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. Plan B was no longer a strategy for mere survival. It was no longer a desperate attempt to stay and reclaim what was mine. It was an extraction mission. I was going to leave at the exact right moment, and I was going to take the only things of actual value in this entire company with me. I was going to make Bryce Kessler realize that true value and real power never resided on an organizational chart. I stood up, slipping my phone back into my pocket. I did not offer Tessa comfort, but I did not offer her cruelty either. She was just another victim of the same predator, even if she had been a willing, arrogant accomplice in her own delusion. "What do I do?" Tessa asked, her voice cracking with genuine fear. "If the Alcott account leaves, Bryce will fire me to appease the board. He will blame the entire operational failure on my transition strategy to protect himself." "Yes," I agreed softly, looking down at her. "He will. That is exactly what a shield is designed to do. It absorbs the impact so the person holding it does not have to." I walked toward the door, my hand resting on the cool metal of the handle. "Haley, wait," Tessa pleaded, standing up. "Help me fix this. Just tell me how to stabilize the routing network. Tell me who to call." I looked back at her over my shoulder, my expression perfectly serene. "I cannot fix it, Tessa. You cannot apply a standardized formula to a burning building. You just have to know when to walk out the front door." I left her sitting in the heavy silence of her stolen office. As I walked down the hallway, my posture was straighter than it had been in months. The battle for the continuity division was officially over. I was no longer fighting for a seat at their table. I was going to build my own table, and I was going to take all of their best guests with me. The week after Tessa's breakdown in her office, My entire strategy shifted from passive observation to active construction. I stopped avoiding the clients and started scheduling quiet, one-on-one breakfasts and coffee meetings. I framed these appointments as routine quality assurance, a standard check-in from the transition strategist to ensure the new operational matrix was serving their needs. In truth, I was conducting a highly localized, deeply calculated stress test on corporate loyalty. I met Reed Alcott at a quiet, wood-paneled steakhouse downtown. He ordered black coffee and looked at me across the pristine white tablecloth. I gave him the standard, sanitized corporate script. I told him I wanted to ensure his properties were feeling fully supported during this structural adjustment. Reed laughed, a harsh, short sound that cut through the quiet murmur of the restaurant. "Do not insult my intelligence, Haley," he said, setting his cup down sharply. "North Hollow is currently a massive liability. I am holding off on the cancellation clause right now purely because it would cost me a fortune to onboard an entirely new vendor before the first major snowfall. But listen to me carefully. If you step outside and hang your own shingle, I want a proposal on my desk the very next morning." Over the next 2 days, I had nearly identical conversations with the vice president of our largest cold chain logistics account and the chief operations officer of a regional hospital supply network. They did not care about the North Hollow brand. They did not care about Bryce Kessler's glossy brochures. They cared about the fact that I was the one who had kept their supply lines alive during the hurricane 2 years ago. 3 separate pillars of our revenue stream looked me in the eye and delivered the exact same message. If I built it, they would follow. I needed to make sure my departure was absolutely bulletproof. I spent a Saturday morning sitting at Nora Keene's kitchen table, surrounded by highlighters and printed legal statutes. Nora was clinical and unapologetically ruthless. "You cannot take a single piece of company property," Nora instructed, pointing a silver pen at me. "No client lists downloaded to a thumb drive, no proprietary algorithms, no internal pricing models. You leave with absolutely nothing but your purse and your brain?" "What about the non-compete clause?" I asked, looking down at the dense contract. "Because they fundamentally altered your job description and removed your executive authority without cause. The non-compete is virtually unenforceable," Nora explained, a sharp, predatory smile forming. "But we must be pristine. You cannot solicit them while you are still on the North Hollow payroll. They have to come to you, or you have to wait until your resignation is formally accepted. You take your reputation, your experience, and the relationships you built with your own 2 hands over the past 16 years. That is legally yours. Everything else stays in the burning building." The following Wednesday, I asked Owen Pike and Marisol Trent to meet me at a diner 3 blocks away from the corporate headquarters. We sat in a back booth, the red vinyl seats cracked and worn. I did not give them a grand emotional speech. I simply told them that North Ledger Advisory was legally active, fully funded by my personal savings, and preparing for a potential operational launch in the next 30 days. Owen stirred his coffee slowly, staring into the dark liquid. "Bryce is going to try to destroy you," he said quietly. "He can certainly try," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But I will not ask either of you to take that risk. If you want to stay and weather the storm, I will completely understand." Marisol shook her head immediately. "I am not burying my career under a mountain of fake analytics," she said, her voice fiercely determined. "The moment you give the signal, my resignation letter is drafted. I am coming with you." Owen nodded in agreement. Looking up, "I have the financial models for a division carve-out ready on my personal server. We just need the runway." The runway presented itself exactly 2 days later, handed to me directly by Bryce Kessler. The client retention metrics for the quarter were bleeding out. The board of directors was starting to ask pointed, uncomfortable questions about the sudden drop in customer satisfaction scores. Bryce summoned me to his top-floor office. He did not offer me my old job back. He was too proud and too deeply entrenched in his fraudulent vendor scheme to admit defeat. Instead, he attempted to create a bureaucratic compromise. "We are launching a specialized client retention task force," Bryce announced, leaning heavily on his mahogany desk, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. Tessa will remain the executive director of the division, of course. But I want you to co-lead this specific initiative. Get back into the trenches. Haley, smooth over these ruffled feathers. Show them the old North Hollow charm. He was asking me to plug the holes in the hull of a sinking ship while keeping me permanently locked out of the captain's chair. A month ago, I would have refused out of sheer principle and professional pride. Today, I smiled politely and accepted the role immediately. I did not accept to save Bryce. I accepted because the co-lead title came with an automatic reinstatement of my administrative system access. Within 1 hour of leaving his office, my security credentials were fully active again. I had unfiltered visibility into the financial pipelines, the projected quarterly loss budgets, the delayed routing tickets, and every single unredacted piece of data Marisol was being forced to hide. I was back inside the mainframe, gathering the exact ammunition I needed for the final strike. Meanwhile, completely blind to the trap closing around her, Tessa made her final, fatal operational decision. Desperate to prove the value of the Harrogate software to the board of directors and secure her own standing, she announced a mandatory, division-wide rollout of the automated platform. All manual overrides were to be permanently disabled by the first week of December. The timing was objectively catastrophic. The regional weather forecasts were already predicting one of the most severe winter storm seasons in a decade. Our frontline operations managers were terrified. A group of 3 senior dispatchers cornered me near the break room, begging me to intervene. "Haley, you have to stop her," the lead dispatcher pleaded, his face pale with anxiety. "If a blizzard hits the interstate and the system locks us out of manual rerouting, we are going to lose millions of dollars of client inventory in a single night." I looked at them, my expression completely neutral, offering none of the maternal reassurance they were used to getting from me. "I am not the executive director," I said calmly. "I do not have the authority to block a software integration." "Then what do we do?" he asked desperately. "You document everything," I instructed softly, stepping closer so my voice would not carry down the hall. "Do not argue with her in the hallway. Do not complain in the internal chat. You write a formal email outlining exactly why the system cannot handle the weather volume. You cite historical data. You copy your direct supervisors. And when she replies telling you to proceed with the rollout anyway, you save that entire thread." They stared at me, slowly realizing that I was not going to play the hero anymore. I was not going to throw my body in front of the train to save the cargo. I was simply telling them to stand back and film the collision. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched the warning emails pile up in the system, meticulously archived by the ops team and willfully ignored by Tessa's administration. I watched Bryce scramble to appease angry board members with fabricated projections. I watched my 3 biggest clients quietly stall their contract renewals, waiting for a signal. When Reed Alcott sent me a final, encrypted text message that simply read, "Call me the second you walk out the door," I closed my black notebook. The strategy was no longer theoretical. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the escape route was perfectly paved. Plan B had a fully operational runway. All I needed now was the perfect storm to force their hands. The polar vortex did not arrive quietly. It descended upon the Midwest late Thursday evening, plunging temperatures to -25 degrees within a span of 4 hours. Ice coated the major interstates, high winds tore down secondary power grids, and the entire logistical map on our operations floor began to blink with urgent, red warning lights. This was the exact scenario our division was built for. It was the ultimate, unforgiving test of our crisis capabilities. And it hit exactly 48 hours after Tessa had permanently disabled all manual overrides to force the entire company onto the Harrogate software. The resulting catastrophe was not a slow leak. It was a spectacular, instantaneous systemic collapse. By Friday morning, the centralized ticketing queue at our Chicago headquarters was utterly paralyzed. We had over 800 emergency dispatch requests backlogged in the system, because local branches no longer had the authority to process localized exceptions. highly trained dispatchers in Ohio, Minnesota, and Wisconsin were forced to sit on their hands, staring helplessly at computer screens while trucks idled and supply chains froze. The first major domino to fall was the premium food distribution network. 6 of their cross-country transport trucks, carrying a combined total of $4 million in perishable luxury imports, were trapped behind a massive pileup on Interstate 94. The refrigeration units on the trailers were failing under the extreme external cold. The local route manager knew a private, climate-controlled warehouse just 3 miles off the exit. In the past, he would have authorized a $20,000 emergency towing and storage fee on the spot to save the cargo. Instead, he was forced to submit a Tier 1 exception form through Harrow Gate. The automated system rejected the private warehouse because it was not in the pre-approved vendor matrix. It demanded 3 competitive bids for alternative routing. While the algorithm searched for non-existent, cheaper options in a frozen wasteland, the refrigeration units finally died. $4 million of inventory turned to garbage on the side of the highway. Then came the true nightmare. Alcott Crest Hotels was hosting a massive, highly publicized global financial summit at their flagship property in Illinois. The regional power grid failed at noon. Their primary backup generators engaged immediately, but due to the unprecedented cold, the fuel consumption rate doubled. They needed an emergency diesel replenishment by midnight, or the entire hotel, filled with 700 high-net-worth guests, would go completely dark. Reed Alcott's on-site team attempted to trigger their customized rapid response fuel protocol. The Harrow Gate system, unable to process the bespoke, unstandardized logic of the contract, routed the urgent request into a general supply queue. It assigned the ticket to a fuel vendor located 3 states away, entirely ignoring the local, emergency-only supplier I had vetted and kept on retainer for a decade. The operations floor was a war zone of ringing phones and frantic shouting. I stood near the main projection screen, my arms crossed, watching the catastrophic failure metrics climb higher with every passing second. Bryce Kessler burst onto the floor. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of red. He dragged the senior operations team into the glass-walled conference room, leaving the door cracked open so his panicked voice echoed across the cubicles. "This is an unprecedented weather disaster," Bryce yelled, slamming his hand onto the conference table. "We communicate this to the clients as an act of God. The infrastructure is failing everywhere. It is not our software. It is the storm. Get the public relations team on the line to draft a force majeure declaration immediately." I walked quietly into the conference room and placed a heavy, organized stack of printed papers directly in front of him. "What is this?" Bryce snapped, glaring at me. "That is a documented chain of 42 separate warning emails from the regional dispatch managers, sent over the last 3 weeks," I said, my voice cutting through his hysteria with cold precision. "They explicitly state that taking away local override authority would result in catastrophic routing failures during a major freeze. The system is functioning exactly as it was programmed to function. You cannot blame God for a bottleneck you intentionally coded into the network." Bryce stared at the papers, his mouth opening and closing as the undeniable, legally binding reality of his negligence stared back at him. He had no spin left. He had no buzzwords to hide behind. I left him hyperventilating over the documents and walked toward Tessa's office. The blinds were drawn, but I opened the door without knocking. Tessa was sitting on the floor behind her massive oak desk, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was weeping, her makeup smeared down her face, her breathing jagged and shallow. The glossy, unearned arrogance she had paraded around the office for the last 2 months was completely eradicated. She looked exactly like what she was, a terrified young woman who had just crashed a plane she was never qualified to fly. She looked up at me, her hands trembling violently. "They are going to fire me," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "The food distributor just sent a formal notice of breach. Alcott Crest is threatening to sue us for gross negligence. Bryce just called me. He screamed at me. He said I completely mismanaged the rollout." I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me, sealing us in the quiet. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not soften my posture. He told me I would be safe, Tessa sobbed, burying her face in her hands. When I signed the Harrogate contract, I saw the back-end failure projections. I asked him about them. He promised me that if I pushed it through, I would be completely shielded at the board level. He said the cost savings would make me a star, and the operational hiccups would be blamed on legacy staff resisting the transition. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place. Bryce had not just manipulated her. He had actively promised her executive immunity in exchange for her signature on a fraudulent contract. "Tessa, look at me," I commanded. She lifted her tear-streaked face. "Do you have that promise in writing?" I asked. "No," she whispered. "It was a private dinner, but he sent me text messages pushing me to ignore the dispatcher warnings. He sent emails telling me to expedite the rollout regardless of the risk. Save every text message, email, and verbal directive you can remember," I said, my tone absolute and unyielding. "Forward them to a secure personal server immediately. Take screenshots. Print physical copies. Do it right now." She stared at me, wiping her eyes, the sheer gravity of my instruction taking hold. She was no longer my rival. She was no longer the arrogant interloper who had stolen my office. She had just been officially drafted as the primary witness for the prosecution. I turned and walked back out onto the chaotic operations floor. The division was tearing itself apart. Supervisors were screaming at monitors. Dispatchers were desperately trying to reach vendors on their personal cell phones, bypassing the locked corporate system entirely. Bryce emerged from the conference room, looking completely hollowed out. He stood in the center of the room, demanding updates, shouting orders that nobody was listening to because his orders meant nothing when the system was dead. He was the chief executive officer, but in the face of a true disaster, his title was entirely meaningless. He had absolutely zero operational value. Then, a strange, undeniable phenomenon began to sweep across the floor. The main corporate switchboard lines stopped ringing. The automated Harrogate client portal went completely silent. Instead, my personal cell phone, resting in the pocket of my blazer, began to vibrate. I pulled it out. The caller identification displayed the name of the senior vice president of Alcott Crest. I let it ring, holding the device in my hand. Then, the private line at my cubicle lit up. A localized dispatcher from Detroit was bypassing his manager to reach me directly. Then, Marisol's desk phone rang, and I heard her tell the caller, "Hold on, I will patch you through to Haley right now." Within 60 seconds, every piece of functional communication in the building was funneling directly toward me. The clients were not calling the corporate hotline. The regional teams were not submitting tickets to Tessa. In the middle of the worst crisis of the decade, the entire multi-million-dollar network instinctively bypassed the fraudulent corporate structure and reached out to the only true foundation left. Bryce stood 10 feet away, watching my phone light up again and again. Our eyes met across the chaotic room, the color completely drained from his face. In that single, agonizing moment, he realized his fatal error. He had spent months carefully rewriting job descriptions, manipulating board packets, and hiding behind slick digital transformation graphics to strip me of my title. But watching the entire industry bypass his authority to beg for my help, Bryce Kessler finally understood his greatest fear. The power had never been in the chair. It had never been in the title. The power was me. And he had just spent the last 2 months perfectly engineering his own destruction by pushing me right out the door. The board of directors mandated an emergency. Comprehensive review by Monday morning. The operational collapse during the freeze had generated enough formal breach of contract notices to trigger a severe panic at the highest levels of corporate governance. By late Friday afternoon, Bryce Kessler summoned me to his top-floor office. The arrogant posture he had wielded like a weapon for the past 2 months was entirely gone. He looked aged, his designer tie discarded, his collar unbuttoned, his face pale against the backdrop of the darkening city skyline. "Haley," Bryce began, his voice adopting a sickeningly soft, collaborative tone that made my stomach turn. We need you to help the company through this difficult time. I will be perfectly transparent with you. The board is furious about the service interruptions. Tessa clearly overstepped her capabilities with this integration. If you can step in, stabilize our key accounts, and calm this storm, I am prepared to have a very serious conversation about the executive director chair. We can fix this. The seat could still be yours. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no sense of vindication, no residual anger, no desperate desire for his approval. I was simply observing a desperate man trying to sell me a ticket to board a sinking ship. I will meet with the clients, I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth or allegiance. I will listen to what they have to say, but I will not make any promises or guarantees on behalf of North Hollow. They have lost faith in the operational machinery of this company. Bryce, I cannot sell them a solution that I do not believe this infrastructure can execute. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. But he did not argue. He could not afford to. He thought he was dangling a promotion to keep me obedient and useful. He did not realize he had just handed me total authorization to openly negotiate with the very people who held his corporate survival in their hands. Over the next 48 hours, I conducted a series of quiet, highly confidential meetings with our most critical accounts. I did not sit across from Reed Alcott or the regional logistics directors to beg for their patience. I did not offer them corporate apologies or fabricated timelines for system improvements. I treated the meetings like a surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness. I am not here to ask you to stay with North Hollow, I told Reed, sitting in the private lounge of his flagship hotel. I am here to ask you a structural question. If there were a new entity, built entirely on the legacy protocols we established over the last decade, with a dedicated team and absolute, unhindered operational authority, what conditions would you require to transition your portfolio? Reed leaned back, studying my face carefully. He did not ask if I was building that entity. He knew. Full transparency on the vendor matrix. Reed answered immediately. A dedicated rapid response team that reports directly to you. And your name as the final signatory on every service level agreement. Give me those 3 things, and I will pull my entire account from Bryce Kessler by the end of the month. The other 2 major accounts echoed Reed's exact sentiments. They did not want better software. They wanted a structural guarantee that their businesses would never again be held hostage by a corporate boardroom's cost-cutting agenda. They were ready to move. The momentum shifted entirely on Sunday evening when Lydia Mercer from Corporate Compliance requested a secure encrypted video call. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She transferred a single, compressed digital folder directly to my private server. This is the final piece of the puzzle, Lydia said, her voice tight with nervous energy. I managed to trace the original digital footprint of the Harrogate software contract. The holding company in Delaware is managed by a proxy firm, but the primary capitalization for that firm came from a private family trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust is Bryce Kessler's brother-in-law. Furthermore, I pulled the network access logs from the night before the board packet was finalized. I have the exact timestamp and the internal protocol address, showing Bryce's terminal accessing the succession planning document and manually deleting your name. I stared at the files downloading onto my screen. It was a perfect, undeniable paper trail of corporate fraud, nepotism, and deliberate sabotage. The financial magnitude of that sabotage became clear the following morning. Owen Pike intercepted me in the parking garage, carrying a thick manila envelope. He looked grim but deeply focused. I ran the proprietary risk models based on the breach notices we received on Friday, Owen stated, handing me the envelope. If Alcott Crest and the Food Distribution Network terminate their contracts, the immediate revenue drop triggers a severe default covenant on our primary corporate credit facility. The bank will immediately freeze North Hollow's operating capital. The direct penalty exposure for the service failures is over $25 million. The resulting credit loss will exceed $150 million. This is no longer a localized public relations issue. Haley, this is a catastrophic financial insolvency event. If they leave, the continuity division effectively ceases to exist. Armed with Owen's devastating financial mathematics and Lydia's undeniable compliance evidence, I drove to Nora Keene's law office. Nora had not been idle. She had leveraged her extensive corporate network to secure an introduction to a mid-sized private equity firm specializing in operational carve-outs. They were a fund that specifically acquired distressed, poorly managed corporate divisions that still retained core, foundational value. Nora and I sat in a conference call with their managing partners. They listened to the financial projections, the guaranteed client commitments, and the legal framework of my untethered non-compete status. By the end of the hour, Plan B was completely locked into reality. It was no longer just a threat of resignation. It was a fully structured, legally sound ultimatum. Either the North Hollow Board of Directors agreed to a structural carve-out, selling the core assets and contracts of the continuity division to my new operational fund, or I would walk out the door, take the three-pillar clients with me legally, and leave Bryce Kessler holding a bankrupt, heavily penalized shell of a company. I returned to the office on Monday afternoon. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The impending board review hung over the executive floor like a guillotine. As I walked toward the break room to get coffee, a hand reached out and pulled me into the darkened supply closet. It was Tessa. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed and shadowed. She did not say a word. She simply pressed a printed stack of screenshots into my hands. I looked down at the papers. They were direct text messages from Bryce, sent to her personal phone late at night over the past 3 weeks. The directives were explicit and damning. Push the rollout. Ignore the localized weather warnings. The board needs to see the vendor integration completed by the end of the month. Do not let the legacy staff slow you down. He told me this morning that he is going to recommend my immediate termination to the board tomorrow, Tessa whispered, her voice devoid of any hope. He is going to tell them I went rogue and ignored his directives. He is going to sacrifice me to save his own equity. She looked at me. No longer a rival, but a casualty of a war she never understood. She had surrendered her final weapon to the only person who actually knew how to use it. "Thank you, Tessa," I said softly, folding the papers and sliding them into my jacket pocket. I stepped out of the closet and walked back onto the operations floor. The chaotic noise of the office faded into the background. Every piece was perfectly positioned on the board. The narrative of 2 women fighting over a middle management promotion was entirely dead. This was a direct, fatal confrontation between a desperate, lying executive machine and a woman who had quietly spent the last 2 months building an unbreakable escape route. The trap was sprung, and Bryce Kessler had no idea he was already standing directly in the center of it. At precisely 9 a.m. on Tuesday, the legal department of North Hollow Response Group received 3 identical certified letters. They arrived via priority courier, cutting through the chaotic aftermath of the operational freeze like a synchronized military strike. Alcott Crest Hotels, the premium food distribution network, and our largest hospital supply syndicate had all officially invoked a rarely utilized continuity clause buried deep within the legal framework of their master service agreements. The language was unified and completely uncompromising. They stated that due to catastrophic vendor failure and gross operational negligence, North Hollow had exactly 10 days to appoint a dedicated senior operator, one who had to be mutually approved by the clients, or the contracts would be terminated with absolute cause. Furthermore, any termination under this specific clause completely nullified the financial penalty usually required for breaking the agreement. The financial heart of the continuity division was suddenly placed on a 10-day life support machine before the morning was over. Marisol Trent and Owen Pike quietly approached my cubicle. They did not carry files or pretend to discuss quarterly analytics. Owen leaned casually against the partition, while Marisol stood close, lowering her voice to a barely audible whisper over the ambient noise of the panicking operations floor. "We drafted the letters last night," Marisol stated, her eyes fierce and entirely devoid of hesitation. "They are sitting in our outboxes right now. They are legally binding. Conditional resignations. The exact second you activate Plan B and walk out those glass doors, we press send." We are not spending another single hour trying to resuscitate a corpse that Bryce Kessler intentionally poisoned. The financial models for your carve-out are fully finalized and sequestered on an external, encrypted drive," Owen added smoothly, his face a mask of professional calm. "We are completely ready. Haley, we are just waiting for your signal." I nodded slowly, acknowledging their absolute loyalty. I did not need to thank them. The mutual understanding of what we were about to build was gratitude enough. Shortly after noon, the inevitable summons arrived. Bryce's executive assistant called my extension, her voice tight and formally clipped, requesting my immediate presence in the private executive boardroom on the top floor. I took my time. I closed my laptop deliberately. I stood up, smoothed the fabric of my tailored blazer, and walked toward the elevators with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who owned the building. The executive boardroom was a vast, soundproof glass box suspended above the city skyline. When I walked in, the atmosphere was thick with an expensive, suffocating desperation. Bryce sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. Flanking him were two senior, notoriously ruthless members of the board of directors. They were men who rarely descended from their private equity towers unless a catastrophic financial liability demanded their personal intervention. Bryce gestured for me to sit in the heavy leather chair opposite him. He attempted a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. He was sweating, a thin, undeniable sheen of panic coating his forehead. "Haley, thank you for coming up on such short notice," Bryce began, his voice dripping with a sickeningly smooth, collaborative tone. "We have been reviewing the operational incident reports from the weekend. The board and I have come to a unanimous realization. The transition strategy was fundamentally flawed. Tessa Vaughn clearly lacks the granular, localized expertise required to run this specific division. We need your leadership to guide the company through this incredibly difficult weather anomaly." He paused, leaning forward, placing his hands flat on the polished wood. He was preparing to offer me the world he had stolen from me. "We are prepared to completely restore your executive title, effective immediately," Bryce declared, looking at the two silent board members for validation. "Furthermore, to recognize your indispensable value, we will increase your equity stake by 15%. We will terminate Tessa by the end of the business day, and we will issue a public press release framing this entire situation as a strategic realignment of our core values. We want you back in the chair. Haley, we need you to fix this." They stared at me, waiting for the gratitude. They waited for me to exhale with relief, to eagerly accept the crown, to thank them for finally recognizing my worth. They genuinely believed that 16 years of loyalty meant my ultimate price was simply a corner office and a better parking spot. I did not smile. I did not lean forward. I kept my posture perfectly straight, resting my hands lightly on the arms of the chair. I looked at the two board members, and then I locked my gaze onto Bryce's terrified eyes. "I appreciate the offer of reinstatement," I said, my voice as cold and smooth as polished marble. "But before we discuss my operational return, I have one extremely specific question." The room grew so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the climate control system. "Does this generous offer of reinstatement include a formal documented correction of the manipulated succession files presented to this exact board 2 months ago?" I asked, watching the color completely drain from Bryce's face. "And more importantly, does this strategic realignment include a public disclosure to our shareholders regarding the financial conflict of interest with Harrow Gate Systems? Specifically, the millions of dollars currently being routed through a Delaware holding company directly into a trust fund controlled by your brother-in-law." The silence that followed was not just heavy, it was absolute, structural devastation. The two board members slowly turned their heads to stare at Bryce. They were entirely unaware of the embezzlement. Bryce looked as though the floor had suddenly opened up beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin a lie, to deny the accusation. But no words came out. That deafening silence told me everything I needed to know. They were not sorry for what they had done to me. They were not attempting to right a moral wrong. They were simply terrified of losing the Alcott Crest revenue, and they desperately needed a highly competent janitor to clean up a massive, bloody crime scene before the auditors arrived. Realizing he was entirely cornered, Bryce desperately attempted to pivot the execution. He slammed his hand against the intercom button on the table. "Bring Tessa Vaughn in here right now," he barked at his assistant. He intended to throw her to the wolves. He planned to blame the entire Harrow Gate implementation and the operational failure squarely on her shoulders, sacrificing her in front of the board to shield his own catastrophic liability. A minute later, the heavy glass door opened. Tessa walked into the room, but she was not the trembling, weeping girl I had left on the floor of her office days ago. She looked exhausted, pale, and entirely stripped of her corporate illusions. But her hands were steady. She was carrying a thick, black leather folder. Bryce immediately went on the offensive. "Tessa, the board and I have reviewed your disastrous rollout strategy. Your blatant disregard for the legacy protocols and your unauthorized push of the Harrogate integration have caused catastrophic damage to this firm. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." Tessa did not flinch. She did not cry. She walked directly to the center of the mahogany table, opened the black folder, and began laying out printed documents in perfect, neat rows in front of the two board members. "I did not authorize the push," Tessa stated, her voice remarkably clear, echoing with the flat tone of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "I was following direct written orders from the chief executive officer. Here are the printed emails from Bryce instructing me to ignore the localized weather warnings. Here are the screenshots of his text messages, sent to my personal cell phone at 11 o'clock at night, demanding I finalize the vendor integration to hide the system flaws from the quarterly audit. And here is a signed affidavit stating that he promised me complete executive immunity if I acted as the sole signatory on the Harrogate purchase orders." She looked directly at Bryce, her expression completely empty. "I am not taking the fall for your embezzlement. I am just the bait you used to catch yourself." The meeting instantly mutated from a desperate human resources negotiation into a catastrophic, company-ending governance explosion. The senior board member on the left pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket and picked up the printed text messages, his face hardening into a mask of pure corporate fury. Bryce sank back into his chair, entirely paralyzed, watching his entire empire burn to ashes on the surface of the conference table. I slowly stood up from my leather chair. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored jacket, making sure the lines were perfectly straight. Bryce looked up at me, his eyes wide, silently begging me to intervene, to use my legendary crisis management skills to somehow put the fire out. He thought I was still fighting for the leadership role. He thought this was a brutal, aggressive negotiation tactic to secure my power within North Hollow. "You brought me into this room assuming I still wanted a seat at your table," I said, my voice echoing with terrifying calm across the ruined boardroom. "You assumed my silence could be purchased with a title you stole and a fraction of equity in a company that is currently rotting from the inside out." I picked up my phone from the table and slipped it into my pocket. "I am not going to help you survive this. Bryce, I am not going to calm the clients down. I am not going to fix the routing matrix. And I am absolutely not going to accept your offer." I walked toward the heavy glass doors, stopping just before I exited. I looked back at the three men and the ruined girl in the center of the room. "I am going home," I stated, the finality of my words hanging in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. "Tomorrow morning, I will not come into this building to ask for anything. Tomorrow, I will arrive to dictate the terms." The emergency summit convened at precisely 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning. It was not just the standard board of directors this time. The grand mahogany table inside the top-floor executive suite was packed to capacity. The lead corporate counsel sat with his hands steepled tightly in front of him. Two senior representatives from our primary commercial lending institution sat beside him, their expressions carved from stone. Dialed in via secure, encrypted video conference were the ruthless legal teams representing Alcott Crest Hotels, our premium food distribution network, and the regional hospital syndicate. Bryce Kessler opened the meeting with the desperate, flailing aggression of a cornered animal. He stood at the head of the table, his suit jacket unbuttoned, trying to project a commanding presence that had entirely evaporated over the weekend. "We are here to address an unprecedented weather event," Bryce announced, his voice tight and overly loud. "But more importantly, we must address a coordinated internal sabotage. Haley Nelson has spent the last 48 hours actively exploiting a natural disaster to leverage our key clients against this institution. She is attempting to fracture this company for her own personal gain. This is a profound betrayal of the organization that built her career." I sat perfectly still on the opposite end of the long table. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my honor. I opened a thick, perfectly organized black leather binder and slid the first heavy stack of printed documents across the polished wood toward the corporate council. "That is a documented timeline spanning the last 60 days, I stated, my tone analytical, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. "It contains exactly 42 separate written warnings from our regional operational managers, predicting this exact system collapse if the localized override authority was removed. It also contains the original succession planning document, unanimously approved by this board, followed directly by the altered version manipulated specifically to exclude my qualifications so Bryce could install a compliant proxy." I slid a second stack forward, pushing it toward the commercial lenders. "Next is the compliance trail. It details the vendor conflict of interest regarding Harrow Gate Systems. Specifically, it proves that the Delaware holding company routing the licensing fees is directly connected to a private trust fund controlled by Bryce's brother-in-law. Finally, you will find the unredacted back-end analytics proving that the recent board packets were intentionally sanitized to hide a 22% failure rate in our new routing matrix." The lead corporate counsel stopped reading and looked up, his face instantly draining of color. Bryce stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "This is completely fabricated out of context," Bryce shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She stole proprietary data to create a false narrative. It is entirely accurate." A quiet, trembling voice interrupted. Tessa Vaughn stepped forward from the shadows at the back of the room. She did not look at Bryce. She looked directly at the two men from the commercial lending firm. "I was recruited specifically to authorize the Harrow Gate integration because Haley Nelson formally refused to sign it," Tessa confessed, her voice gaining strength with every word. "Bryce Kessler promised me complete executive protection from the board if I pushed the software through and took the public blame for any localized friction. I have submitted all text messages and emails verifying this arrangement directly to corporate compliance." The room was paralyzed by the confession. Before Bryce could even draw breath to scream at her, Lydia Mercer from compliance stepped through the doorway. She did not speak. She simply nodded once to the corporate counsel to confirm the absolute validity of Tessa's statement and the digital evidence. Then, Owen Pike stood up from his seat in the gallery. He held a single, devastating sheet of paper. He handed it directly to the lead commercial lender. "If the three major accounts currently watching us on that video screen execute their termination clauses by Friday, North Hollow Response Group will instantly violate its minimum revenue covenant," Owen explained with lethal financial precision. "We will face an immediate credit default. The penalty exposure from the operational failures is $25 million. The resulting credit contraction will bankrupt the continuity division within 30 days. The senior representative from the lending institution did not even blink. He slowly lowered the paper and looked directly at Bryce. "Your operational credit line is frozen, effective immediately. You are to step down from all executive decisions regarding this division pending a full forensic financial audit." Bryce opened his mouth, looking frantically around the massive room for an ally, a lifeline, a bureaucratic loophole. There was absolutely nothing but the cold, hard stare of impending financial ruin. He had built his entire career on corporate manipulation, but he could not manipulate a balance sheet that was actively bleeding to death in front of the bank. The lead board member turned his attention to me, his voice heavily resigned, the arrogance completely gone. The clients on the screen have indicated they will only remain if you are given absolute, unhindered operational control. We can restructure the entire hierarchy. We can remove Bryce today. What are your specific terms for reinstatement? This was the moment. This was the exact intersection of meticulous strategy and total liberation. I am not seeking reinstatement, I said smoothly, standing up from my chair. I am not asking for a promotion, and I am not asking to sit in Bryce's chair. That chair sits inside a structurally compromised building. I reached into my briefcase and placed one final perfectly bound document onto the table. It bore a crisp, unfamiliar logo in dark navy and silver. "This is North Ledger Advisory," I announced, the name echoing in the silent room. "It is a fully funded, legally independent operational consultancy. It possesses a pristine legal framework, and the core operational staff of your current continuity division have already signed conditional letters of intent to join my team. I am not here to resign and leave you with a catastrophic legal mess. I am here to offer you the only mathematically viable exit strategy." I looked at the corporate council, then to the silent board members. "You have two choices," I explained calmly. "You can spend the next 5 years drowning in litigation while your top-tier accounts bleed out, ultimately liquidating this division for parts to satisfy the bank. Or, the board can authorize a clean, immediate operational carve-out. North Ledger Advisory will formally acquire the core assets, the active client contracts, and the specialized personnel of the continuity division. We will take the massive liability completely off your hands. We will keep the clients stable, and your firm will receive a highly negotiated buyout sum that will pacify the lenders and keep North Hollow out of bankruptcy court." The sheer, undeniable brilliance of the trap finally dawned on Bryce. He slumped back into his chair, entirely defeated, staring blankly at the polished wood. He could not threaten me with human resources. He could not leverage my title, my salary, or my unvested equity. I had brought a solution that saved the board from total annihilation, and the only cost was surrendering the very kingdom he had tried to steal from me. I had not just burned his corrupt house down. I had legally purchased the land it stood on for pennies. The board members did not even need to leave the room to deliberate. They looked at the furious, unforgiving clients on the screen, the frozen credit line, and the airtight evidence of financial fraud. They chose corporate survival. They agreed to the terms of the carve-out on the spot. Bryce Kessler was quietly forced into early retirement by the end of the week. His exit stripped of any financial golden parachute due to the impending federal compliance investigation. Tessa Vaughn signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, received a modest severance package to ensure her silence, and quietly vanished from the corporate landscape. As for me, I packed exactly one cardboard box. I did not take back my old corner office. I walked out of the glass doors of North Hollow Response Group and never looked back. 6 months later, I stood in the expansive, sunlit lobby of a high-rise building on the opposite side of the city. The morning sun poured through the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, illuminating the sleek, brushed steel letters mounted prominently on the reception wall North Ledger Advisory. I held a cup of dark coffee, watching the floor buzz with focused, purposeful, and brilliant energy. Owen Pike was walking out of a glass conference room, laughing comfortably with the chief financial officer of Alcott Crest Hotels. Marisol Trent was pointing at a massive digital monitor, running true, unfiltered predictive analytics for the upcoming winter storm season. Every single one of my elite dispatchers, the dedicated veterans who knew exactly how to bend the rules to save our clients, were sitting at their state-of-the-art desks, working in an environment built entirely on trust, respect, and absolute competence. There were no meaningless corporate buzzwords spoken here. There were no hidden vendor contracts draining our resources. There was absolutely no one who could ever call me into a room and strip away my life's work with a single, arrogant sentence. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute, undeniable weight of true power. They thought they stole my future. All they really did was force me to build one they could never control. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, like the video, and support the channel by hit the like button so this story can reach even more people.